Mm.
Hello everybody and welcome back to firepowergaming.com for a rather special edition this evening. Something that we're calling Mentioned in Dispatches, which we hope very much is going to become a regular feature on the channel, where I gather learned colleagues and fellow wargamers to discuss the most pressing and serious issues of the day. And obviously that leads me inevitably to have invited Joe and Tom along. So if you wouldn't mind, Joe, please introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, a little bit about your background and what you're interested in.
Hi, so I'm Joe Bilton, and on Twitter I'm Joe_wargamer, and I do lots of terrain. That's what I'm sort of like most known for in the wargaming world thing. I do lots of buildings and stuff. My job is I make D&D maps, RPG battle maps. And I used to be a teacher, and I stopped being a teacher so I could draw dungeons instead, which is very cool. I've wargamed for about 2.5 years, but I've always, like, since I was a teenager, I've been into history, particularly World War II stuff. I used to paint airfix kits when I was a kid, and then like shooting with an air rifle and things to try and do my own ballistics tests. So my biggest interest really is World War II, 28mm World War II stuff. But I do like all World War II history and other history as well, but particularly World War II. Yep, that's me.
Oh, well, fantastic. Tom, adding an international flavour to tonight's broadcast, tell us a bit about yourself.
We'd have to have an Irishman into this to balance it all out. So, good evening. Name's Tom Egan. I'm equally one of this trio, I suppose, on Twitter, and my handle is the same as my name. I guess I'm probably best known for my World War II stuff, maybe. I think at least that's where I started out on Twitter very much. So clearly I'm from Ireland. I'm a serving military officer. I'm currently serving as an instructor in the military college. So I guess I get to combine the best of both playing and learning and taking some aspects of my hobby into work, and then vice versa, which has been fantastic. From a hobby perspective, I guess, World War II would be my core focus, and that's traditionally been 28mm. But I guess, as you get more into it, I've found myself kind of broadening horizons. And so touching on to Napoleonics and a bunch of other things, including coming back to some old favorites like Space Hulk as well in recent months, which has been in great fun. But that's pretty much it. And I suppose outside of those particular ones, I have a particular kind of, not focus, but interest in terms of taking some of that historical focus or that historical wargaming and blending it very much in terms of some of the stuff that we do at work and whatnot, and trying to make it that little bit, or at least more historically focused, or perhaps more realistically focused as well, which has been a lot of fun. So that's me.
Well, fantastic. And I'll just complete the circle. So my name's Andrew. Obviously on Twitter is FP Gaming UK. My other account, which is a slightly more lowbrow, is Dicedad. And I tend to be very much the hobby butterfly, really. Very much attracted by shiny new things in as many different scales as I possibly can, which inevitably leads to piles of semi-completed and unfinished projects waiting to get on the table. So thanks a lot for joining me tonight, chaps. I really appreciate it. I suppose the first thing to talk about, been a lot of changes over the last few months. We're now starting to come out of lockdown, celebrating Freedom Day, obviously. And a lot of changes are going to occur as a result. So we've got quite a lot of ground to cover over the last few months. So what have we been up to, and what are we doing at the moment? What are we buying? What are we interested in? What's happening in your hobby world, Tom?
Well, where do you? I think we'd spend a whole evening talking about that. But it's been interesting the last few months. I was away overseas last year on UN service, so I was effectively like out of the hobby, as in practically doing it for 6 months or so. which was grand. You came back in the start of January and really kind of trying to reintegrate from there. And I came back into a lockdown. So the hobby was in full lockdown, but I still had I had re-access to all my stuff. And so since the start of the year, really, I think we have been virtually gaming through various mediums. I started virtual gaming, which, you know, was a kind of a big step. How do we even do this? How does it work? And it's been brilliant. Really, really great wargaming with people from all around the world, both myself, you know, personally, and then via some of the virtual art events that have been going on as well. So the focus of the hobby then has been, if I'm being honest, largely driven by the virtual gaming and getting ready for whatever games were coming up. And I have really, in the last 6 months, I would say 7 months, broadened my hobby horizons more than I have done so in the past 25 years, maybe, give or take, insofar as I've dipped into Napoleonics from World War II. I have touched upon and played some ancients. Haven't really bought anything yet, but I've played some ancients. I've bought a fair bit of Napoleonics and I've started into those, which are practice rules of 28 mil. And then I've been consistently doing the World War II gaming. I would have largely played the bolt action rule set, including, you know, a platoon level, and then I would have amended it myself all the way up to company level. So we did some of that, and then myself and Joe there have been taking our first steps into chain of command, which has been a whole other learning curve, and it's been great. We've been learning the rule set between the pair of us and getting to grips with it, and really finding out how it ticks. And really working towards that. In terms of the actual hobby production, in terms of like producing miniatures and stuff, I haven't really done that much painting, certainly nowhere close to what I was doing before I deployed last year, because I found out once you take real life out of it and you have the hobby time left, I've spent most of that time either preparing to play a game or actually gaming. So I've been doing far more gaming, ironically, in a lockdown, you know, than I have actually a hobby, I would suggest. So yeah, so that's been really good. The most immediate, most pressing, most recent thing that we did was we had the recent Virtual Art 6 event that was held on the 10th of July virtually. And I had, having played in the 2 previous virtual arts, I was semi-volunteered into hosting a game of a game, and then I chose to host an introductory game of Chain of Command. So we spent with Joe, you know, a lot of help with Joe, prepping for that over the last 3 or 4 weeks, and since that's passed off on the 10th of July, been kind of in that post high point kind of plateau stroke downward draft over the last week or 2. So yeah, so that's it. To summate, lots of virtual gaming, 28 mil World War II, and an awful lot of retrograde Space Hulk, which has been so much fun. Yeah. And then outside of that, actual hobby, painting, making, prepping, purchasing, to support both of those, really. So yeah, so that's the last kind of couple of months, I think. Yeah.
No, I mean, that's really cool. And I think one of the things I'd just like to do as well, because as you say, we've all enjoyed virtual art, either this year or in previous events. And I think Jeremy really deserves an enormous shout out for the amount of work and the amount of effort he puts into pulling this event together. And you know, and it is fantastic that the community is so supportive of it as well. I think it's brilliant. But one of the things I want to ask you then, Tom, is, you know, as a newcomer to Chain of Command, it must have been quite daunting setting out your wares, so to speak, with probably seasoned wargamers that have been playing Chain of Command since the day it came out.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I don't know if we'll come around to it later on, but definitely, like, it was a massive learning curve. Like, I would consider myself no stranger to virtual wargaming displays. I'd say since January, since I've come back, I've probably been averaging 2 games a week, maybe virtually, like, which is an unreal amount of wargaming. But I guess I've been wargaming with I don't want to say a tight group of people, but people that I would interact with on a daily
Yeah.
basis on Twitter. Yeah, people I would consider to be friends at this stage. Yeah, and so we know each other. I guess we know how we're approaching a game, because once you're doing it over that virtual medium, like, it's brilliant, but it is different. And so when I was hosting it and playing with people like yourself or Joe or Jeremy or numerous other people, yeah, I guess we had that connection. But on Virtual Art, for the very first time, I was hosting a game for people that I really, outside of one person out of four, I had never interacted with really before. And so you don't know how they're approaching the game and what they would like to take from the game. And that definitely is not a bad thing, but it definitely changes that dynamic a little bit. And it was a bit of a learning curve. And then, I mean, if we're being honest, like I by chain of command, it's like an onion. There are so many levels of nuance, and I don't want to say complexity, but complexity and detail within the rules that it takes for it. It's a great trying thing to master.
Prep things, our planning sessions, it was really helpful then doing things like playing, like we did the close combat situation, right, and just set up the troops ready for close combat, and played it through a few times, and like, just because you had that one bit in isolation, it was quite nice to go, hang on a second, I actually don't know now, really thinking about it, this is really important that you don't charge, they're pinned and so on, and that then playing it several times really let you sort of unpeel the layers of the onion, sort of thing, and see some of that that you might lose if you just had it as part of a session within a whole battle. But by it being given its own space when you're learning it, it was quite good to sort of draw that out.
Definitely, yeah, definitely, and it was. And here it was a great. I mean, as a morning, it was great. We played for the morning session, and there was a lot to learn from it. I would definitely host again, but it's one of those things I think where you get better at it the more that you do. And yeah, it would definitely leave you wanting to do more of it. But yes, I think, even though I was trying to Rich Clark from Two Fat Hardys afterwards, and even Rich was saying I had set myself somewhat of a tall mountain to climb for the very first one. But like, is that not I mean, for me personally, I think that's the best way to really kind of confirm and consolidate kind of like the stuff that myself and Joe had been doing for 4 weeks or so before that, and hands off, if we hadn't been doing that, I wouldn't have been in no position to really, play the game myself, let alone bring other individuals through. So yeah, it's been great. So I think that's a whole other discussion, that hosting a virtual game, but yeah, there's an awful lot to take from it. And it was really, I'm probably still doing a bit of a after action review of it in my own head, to be honest with you, 2 weeks later. So yeah, that's that.
I mean, that's excellent. And I mean, yeah, I mean, thoroughly endorse Chain of Command, and what a fantastic set of rules it is. And I must admit, I was quite pleased when I heard that you'd both started to play it. I thought the scales had fallen from your eyes, the road to Damascus experience.
Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. Really pleased about that. So then, Joe, what have you been up to?
I mean, all my stuff is World War II, and because we've got quite a small house, right, and already the loft is nearly all entirely my stuff, right, and there's buildings and like model buildings on most surfaces and in the kitchen and stuff. So in order to be able to keep filling the house with this stuff, we basically have to keep it one scale and one theatre, right? So one sort of historical period and stuff. So as much as I would sort of, I see like the Napoleonic stuff, and that's pretty cool, and I sort of see the ancient things and go, that's pretty cool. But I sort of like stay World War II. But within World War II, I'm like all over the place sort of thing. So I mean, I've done a lot of work on Normandy stuff, and that's my sort of go-to background work with it, right? If I've got a spare day, I think, what should I build today? It's invariably something for Normandy, right? So I've been doing a lot of ruins actually lately, because I was playing a game back in like March or something, and I thought, wow, you know what, like nearly all my buildings are intact, right, I need some ruins. And so I picked up like 12 ruins from Empires at War, and just had fun making the ruins and like working out new techniques for ruins and stuff. So that's my background stuff. So there's always some Normandy stuff going on. But I've also got, I had started last year, I started a US Marine and Japanese force, right? And before winter kicked in, I made a new terrain map and I made loads of jungly foliage stuff. But then it came winter and I couldn't really make that anymore because that stuff needs a lot of drying time and it's very messy and stuff. And so I couldn't work outside with that. So that got sort of like shelved. And then I got the stuff out again to start doing some more on it. But then I got the Normandy ruins from Empires and I was like, well, I'll just finish a few more ruins first, you know. Yeah, so they're sort of in the background there and stuff. But I played the virtual lab thing as well, and I played Alex's Star Wars inspired sort of like reskin of it. It was a great game, really good fun. I'm still mourning the loss of my ATST within. I was gutted. It came on, all guns blazing, looking all majestic. And then some git with a rocket launcher killed it straight away. And I was like,
there's always a lad with a bazooka equivalent. Doesn't matter what period or what year. There's always some lad.
Could be some like you play like Infamy and still have a guy with a rocket launcher, you know, pop up somewhere. So that was a great game, but galling that I lost that straight away. But that was good. And then I as Tom was saying, I've sort of like just got into playing Chain of Command. And sort of like learning the rules and stuff, and playing lots of practice games has been really good. In fact, I hosted a game for someone else, a guy called Bushy Beard Tom on Twitter, and
who's also got a YouTube channel, which is well worth subscribing to.
Yeah, he has. So he was like, oh, I fancy a game, and I was like, you know what? I'll host a game for you and stuff. And it was quite a good learning thing for me to like a proof of the pudding thing to go, right, do I know the rules well enough that I can host it and run the game properly and stuff. Actually, it was good. Like I had to, look up some bits and stuff to go, okay, hang on, I rolled a 4 on the leader being wounded. What does that mean? Sort of thing, right? But the combat flowed nicely for me. I knew, okay, they're in cover. They're being fired at this. I've got to roll these numbers, and so those things were going well and quite quickly and stuff. And he had a good game, and I enjoyed the game as well. And it did give me more confidence to to like run games, but also that my own understanding of Chain of Command obviously is all right because it's a good game, ran well. But out of that actually came the fact that I realised that I was missing some miniatures to make up the platoons according to the sort of rule book and stuff. And so I had because Bushy Beard Tom couldn't see close up, some of his riflemen actually had submachine guns, right? I just called them rifles. But so I was like, well, I'll just top up some bits and stuff. So I the last few days, yesterday actually it was last few days, I painted up a load of new French and Blitzkrieg Germans from Crusader. So I thought I'd just fill up some gaps, a bunch of new riflemen and stuff and things. So that. What else? I had a magazine article published in WSS magazine, which is cool. Yeah, it was a guide to upgrading MDF buildings. So I got a lovely kit from Colin at Charlie Foxtrot Models, and covered it in polyfiller basically. And that's my technique, literally just cover the building in polyfiller.
I'm sure there's a bit more to it than that, Joe.
In household emulsion, and that's the upgrade. And that was cool. So that was in there, and actually I've got a couple of other ones I'm working on for future issues and stuff, which is nice. So apart from Normandy and the Japanese stuff, I was also doing some stuff on Berlin. I sort of always had the goal of having like a nice ruined German city sort of table. You can just sort of like fill with Hitler Youth and Volkssturm and stuff, and have Russian tanks coming in. That's quite cool. So to help that, I made a new like terrain board made from wallpaper, All right, so I found a it's on eBay. It was a particular brand of like fancy Italian textured paper, but it looks like cobbles. And so I got these MDF boards and I stuck it down and painted it up and stuff. And it gave me just a big plain, you know, like cobbled street thing. And then I put French stuff on it first of all and did like a nice rubbly ruined town. But it was good because that means I can use that for any ruined city now, sort of thing. So I painted up a ruined house, a ruined townhouse thing from Sarissa. I've got other 4 or 5 of those in a box waiting to be built as well. Once I finish some Normandy stuff, I've got. I can't think. I found someone, an MDF producer who made some like Berlin ruins. I can't think what his name was. He hasn't got a shop anymore, right? And I had to like dig around, and I found his email address, and I emailed him, and he said, "Oh yeah, I'll do them on, like, you know, like just as a casual order sort of thing." But I got a couple of those, and I'm going to paint those up and do those and stuff. And so the goal will be maybe like, you know, around like Christmas time to have a full Normandy. Sorry, I'm addicted to Normandy. A full Berlin. Every third word is Normandy. A full Berlin sort of table stuff that I can then also use for Normandy, like Caen, and I can also use as like Stalingrad and Kharkiv, and, you know, any sort of like ruined city and stuff. Yeah, so lots of bits around. In my head, there's always the thing of like, well, at some point I must do a winter table, and at some point I must also do like Italy, and I must also do Africa, and I must also do Burma. And so there's a lot of things that are to do. But yeah, so quite a mixed bag of World War II things, but always with a flavour of Normandy.
Oh, well, that's fantastic, Joe. And while we're on the subject of recommendations and dropping names, I don't know if you've seen the Project Wargaming YouTube channel, but Aaron made a fantastic 6mm Berlin table, and he's got a series of tutorials about how he did it all, and it covers an enormous sweep of central Berlin, and it's fantastic. And then the Little Wars TV guys actually used the board in one of their games.
Right.
Brilliant.
So it's well worth checking out. It's very inspiring.
Did you ever see the Reichstag table that you know, Rich H, who was it Field Armories?
Yeah.
He made this table that he took to show us a few years back, and it was like a 28mm scale Reichstag front.
Wow.
And it's amazing. It's on, if you go on Lead Adventure forum, right? There's pictures hanging around still. It's amazing, and I think he sold it in the end. But it was massive, and he like the combination of like 3D prints and MDF laser cut stuff.
Okay.
It's so good.
No, I mean that's fantastic. You know, and hats off to anybody who can make terrain to, you know, that kind of standard. I'm just absolutely in awe, really. So, I mean, well, for me, the last few months have been pretty hectic, really. Obviously, kicked the channel off at the height of lockdown boredom, and that's still been ticking over quite nicely. But in terms of projects, I'm just looking at my placemat in front of me that serves as my painting table, and I've got some 6mm sci-fi on there, got some 10mm Napoleonics, got some 28mm fantasy, and a Saxon warband for Dux Britanniarum as well. And over lockdown, I mean, it was just such a productive time for painting. I mean, I found, I find painting incredibly relaxing. I think increasingly I've become aware it's very much part of helping maintain your well-being, and you know, it is a method of just zoning out and escaping and just getting some quality time to yourself. But over lockdown, I did very large, well, for my standards, very large 15mm French Napoleonic army for sharp practice, which is now kind of big enough to also use for black powder as well. I've got a 15mm 100-Year War project on the go. I've finished my Romano British for Duxbury, and so the Saxons are to finish, and hopefully over the course of the next couple of weeks, they'll be done.
Mm.
And I'm also doing, or I've started to do the 1809 campaign in 10mm. So I've just done my first brigade's worth of Austrian infantry, and there are many, many hundreds more of those waiting to paint. And while I was doing all that, I also did Italian, Africa Corps, and 8th Army forces for Iron Shotgun as well.
Mm.
So I really need to crack on with my late war Germans and my Russians, and then I'll start to feel that I'm getting somewhere. My mate, who I regularly game with, called Nigel, gamely volunteered to paint the Americans. So I thought that was really good of him, but quite frankly, the least that he could have done, to be honest with you.
You were 3D printing a lot of those, Andrew, weren't you? That earlier in the year you were making serious strides in terms of churning out armored divisions worth of tanks, right?
Yeah, I printed. The first foray into 3D printing was around the 10mm Cold War gone hot. So I've got a British mechanised company with chieftain support and also a Soviet motor rifle company. And all the vehicles for those were 3D printed.
Mm.
And then that led on to printing stuff for Iron Shotgun. And I'm not at the point yet where I'd necessarily print miniatures. The vagaries of printing means that, you can just have too many failures, really. And I do still like metal miniatures, I must admit. I like them. But for things like terrain and vehicles, it's fantastic.
Mm.
And obviously the great thing about a printer is you can take a model in any scale and print it to whatever size you desire. So from that side of things, it's been fantastic. And I know that you, Joe, you use 3D printing a lot with your terrain making as well, don't you? I mean,
I haven't got a printer myself, but Paul Sabotage Print, Paul Edwards, he prints like endlessly for stuff for me. So I message him and go, "Hey, Paul, any chance you could make a insert obscure thing?" Is like, "Yep, done. I'll do that. Done." So like I did as part of my chain of command prep thing. I did a load of new jump off points, and in my first game of it, I had just used like barrels or crates and stuff, sort of fuel drums and things. And I thought, well, like they sort of like looked wrong in the terrain, right? So I like because I spend a lot of time trying to make the terrain realistic, like French road signs and lampposts and stuff, and having these like huge oil drums in the middle of like a cornfield sort of like stood out too much. Like why are they here? Why would the scouts, why would the advanced scouts, right, take with them some like 80-gallon oil drums and then go, yeah, the Germans will never know we're here, let's lead them in this field, right? And so I put a list of. I asked on Twitter, and some of your ideas, Andrew, were on there as well. So what would be good like scatter, which I could use as jump off points. And so I got a big list. I emailed them. I sent them not email. I DM'd them to Paul. Said, right, could you make some jump off point things? Like, yeah, what do you want? And I was like, right, 2 tractors, a scarecrow, some barns, this, and I went through a massive list of bits and stuff. And he printed those off, and they're brilliant, and using them in the game. I played them in the game the other day with Bushy Beard Tom, and it was really good because he said, okay, this jump point's in this field, and I could pick. Oh look, it's a cornfield, and I've got one that's got like a hay bale on it. That like one that you can sort of picture then when they were like in like the real war. You can sort of picture the officers using little local landmarks as actual jump-off points, right? Saying to the soldiers, that track up by the barn, once you go past that, that's the front line, watch out for snipers from that point sort of thing. Or, go around, there's a scarecrow there, head up past that bit. So those sort of things. So I made a huge amount. I made like 15 rural ones that had, tractors and barns and wagon wheels and whatever stuff, and then like another like 12 or so that were urban ones with like burnt out cars and like memorials and like push carts and stuff, you know, sort of thing. So yeah, so I used that was good 3D printing there, and I've used it as well for adding things like dormers and chimneys to MDF kits and stuff, you know, because you can't make dormers from scratch, but they're a pain in the ass to sort of get them right, you know. The angles of the rooftop and stuff is annoying, but Paul just prints my dormers and I just stick them on and then put polyfiller on them. That's what I do.
Blend them in, that's it.
Blend them in with polyfiller, yeah. He does like, you know, Paul does like it's excellent detail. I just cover it in polyfiller.
Make it look awesome.
Yeah. Paul is oh, I think my connection has.
All right.
Okay, guys, we're back. Sorry, my connection dropped there, so that all went a bit squiffy then. So I will cut.
Yeah, no, I ordered about 7 big bottles of big tubs of polyfiller from B&Q, and the guy turned up at the door and he said, "Oh, you're doing some DIY in your house during lockdown," and I was like, "Yep." I'm just gonna be, you know, doing
the DIY is not so much in this house; it's on the entire village from Normandy.
I'm working on houses. Yeah, in many ways, I am working on a house.
Yeah. You know, many houses.
Yeah. I'm doing a whole village, mate. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're good decorating your house. I've built a whole town. Yeah.
If only you knew.
Only you knew. Yeah. Oh, you also bought 3 welcome mats. Yes.
Yes. That's most of the countryside east of the town.
Well, the thing is, yeah, right. I reckon like B&Q must think, oh, do you know what? Like these welcome mats are a top seller, right? Yeah. Like it's weird. Every few weeks, all these blokes come in and just buy welcome mats, right? Like hundreds. Sometimes they buy welcome mats that are the cheap ones that look like plough fields and stuff, you know. I'm like, oh, they always buy polyfiller. They buy tons of brown paint. Like they must inform their
purchasing orders. Is
right. Yeah. There's a big trend, right? Obviously, a big trend in brown paint and welcome mats, right? Yeah. Let's invest heavily in that, you know.
You're skewing their metadata, Joe. That's
absolutely
what you're doing completely. I am. You know,
I am totally. They're going to be like, you know, if I stop making models, they'll go, "Where's the market gone?" I don't understand.
Well, like, I have to say, I as soon as I saw Joe's post on that, I was like, yeah, he's spot on. So I have to say, I completely and shamelessly followed Joe's lead and did exactly the same thing or ordered much the same stuff. But it's such a clever idea, and you come back to why Joe's tables are particularly when you know the terrain element. I think we've kind of stumbled onto it. Like, it can be so important. It's what makes it so immersive. Like, and we're talking about the terrain here. I think we've yet to really mention the models. Like in terms of making the table that first. Like that's the environment into which we put all these miniatures, and then we play out whatever scenario we're doing. But you know, Joe's idea there of, and it's exactly what would happen. Like the platoon commander telling the lead section, down into the ditch, 300 yards, there's a cross or there's a burnt out tractor. Go left at that, 200 yards, and there's a ditch line. From there on, you're in that's where you're going to bump into contact, or that's where the main line of defense is. And particularly for that jump off point thing where we're talking about from chain of command's perspective. To be able to have a stone cross in a field or a burnt out tractor at the corner or whatever, and that to have that, to be able to script that tiny, and they're only 28 mil, they're tiny little elements of terrain, scattered terrain. It's not even the terrain at the table, it's adding that extra level of detail to it, but yet it makes such an amazing difference to it for such a little, and really for a little, compared to the time Joe spent on his buildings, or his burnt, his ruined buildings or whatever, and it makes such a difference, both from a game perspective, and from that immersive element of it as well, which is great. So yeah, the 3D printing for that type of stuff has been really, really helpful. And like I know Joe has done the MDF buildings, whereas all of my buildings are 3D printed buildings. So I've gone the other extreme, so to speak. Yeah. And I would be nowhere near in any way, shape, or form as talented as Joe with the terrain. So for people that want to go, like, you know, have a table that is certainly, you know, a really good looking table with, in terms of relatively, I would suggest little creativity or work, really, because the buildings are, you know, they're so fantastic themselves. Just basing them and painting them, like, you know, a spray coat, a wash, a dry brush, and then placing them onto a base, maybe with some texture paint or some grouting around them with some flock and some tufts. I mean, it looks brilliant. Like, but that terrain element it can be so much fun, and yet it adds so much to a game. It really, really does, you know.
Well, Tom, hold that thought, because that would kind of segueing into the main topic of conversation tonight. One thing that does spring to mind is, though, that it'll be interesting to see the next time we meet and have this discussion, just how much progress we made in comparison to the catalogue of things that we've been able to do over lockdown.
Yeah.
I'm sure it'll be back to I've done half a dozen figures and I've managed to build a model. And that'll be it. So tonight's topic then, when we originally began discussing this, we were talking about D-Day, and obviously back in June it seemed incredibly contemporaneous to be doing so, but we're now kind of moving towards the end of July, but obviously the whole Normandy campaign is still a very timely thing to be discussing, and it also sort of dovetails with another theme around introducing and bringing people into the hobby that I've been very keen to pursue through the channel. So I think sort of tonight's topic, if you don't mind, chaps, I'd like to sort of talk about, how you identify a campaign or a project that is of interest to you, that you want to take from, maybe some historical knowledge, or maybe just some vague passing knowledge. Maybe you've seen Saving Private Ryan or some other sort of film, and all of a sudden you think, well, that'd be cool. It's got some toy soldiers in the garage. How do you actually get to grips and start to deliver these kind of projects in a kind of meaningful and a manageable way, really? And I suppose one of the questions I just wanted to ask, obviously D-Day is an enormous operation, combined arms, the maritime element of it is just huge. Would you necessarily start at something as ambitious as that as a new project?
What, the whole entire D-Day?
Yes.
I would say that's ambitious. Definitely, even for us, Joe, that is ambitious project.
By next spring, maybe I might.
Yeah. I think we both need to retire, Joe, and do it full time. I'm not even sure then
just spend the next 40 years just
and
then you're 90 years old and you're like, I've built every building in Normandy.
We're like, come on, Joe, we'll actually finally play the game.
Tom's died.
I can't hear you, Joe. No, it's a really good question. Like, where do you even start? I mean, like, there are so many questions. That's a really difficult one.
I think when you sort of try and start with like Normandy is covered heavily in like films and TVs and obviously the really strong visuals and stuff are often like 101st Airborne in the Bocage, right? That's like the super. When you think of Normandy, you invariably think of either the landings on the beach themselves, or you think of like Private Ryan, obviously that's their Rangers and stuff, but airborne and stuff in the Bocage, fighting dug-in Germans and stuff, right? So that's the sort of like. So I think maybe a good starting point would be, you want to sort of capture. I sort of find you want to sort of capture the essence of the combat or of the operation sort of thing, right? And so you wanted to get a flavour of a Normandy campaign thing, and you want to have lots of you want to have that like that rural table, right, of a couple of little like Norman farmhouses and stuff, and some little sunken lanes and hedgerows and golden wheat fields and trees and stuff, right? And so I would approach it in terms of going, well, I approach all the projects really in terms of going, what terrain do I need first before I really think about getting on with the soldiers, sort of thing. And so I would go, well, okay, I'm going to focus on one element. I'm going to start on, if I was totally brand new to wargaming, right, like World War II wargaming, and I thought I want to get into Normandy, then I would think, all right, I need basically I need a terrain map, either made one or bought one. I need to make a lot of bocage from clump foliage type stuff. I need a handful of trees, a couple of buildings, and that would be the core of my sort of table. And then I would pick two forces that represent the sort of classic Normandy thing. So I would go for 101st Airborne versus, I'd probably say Fallschirmjäger, but maybe just some Grenadiers, just for sort of more neutral, if you're just, sort of getting into it, sort of thing. And just do a small platoon versus platoon sort of game and things. Just as a, like a springboard into it. Once you've got those things, once you've got that stuff, then it's, it's easy then to go, right, okay, I've got airborne. I'm also now going to make a British force, so I can have British versus, this German army and stuff. And now I've got these trees, I'm going to make an orchard now. And I think that's a good starting point because obviously the whole Overlord campaign is so massive, like so huge, that you really want to start with a small microcosm of the whole thing as your starting point.
I mean, I suppose one of the things about playing a period or a campaign as popular as Normandy is that we're blessed with the amount of readily accessible starter boxes that are available to people now, which I think is absolutely fantastic as a tool to introduce people to the hobby. Some of the kits that are available and at the prices at which they're offered, I just think are absolutely fantastic. So unsurprisingly, I suppose, then, Joe, if I could characterise your offer, you'd start off by thinking about the terrain.
Yeah, that's how I start thinking.
So what about you, Tom? Where would you begin?
I'd be on the other side of the fence, actually. I'd start with the forces and then work my way back, is how I would probably do it. And again, like Joe's right. Joe's completely right. You're going to have, if you were completely new to it and you had no wargaming experience, well, then you're most likely going to start at the point, or your starting point for that journey is going to be, well, the images of that are popularly known. Yeah, okay, be that from a film or from a book or somewhere. That's the initial point of inspiration, we're going to call it. Yeah. And for me, those will largely be a photograph of a unit or in action or a vehicle or something like that. And then that will get me thinking about, well, what was the regiment, what was the battalion, what was the unit, what was the type of fighting that they were doing, who were they fighting against? And then how would I look to balance both of those up? And then if you figure that element out, or when you kind of figure that element out, then that situates you in a place in time and space. So for instance, if you are, and I would agree with Joe, like one of the there's two classic elements really, there are three classic elements, isn't there? There's the beach element, and that's either going to be Americans, British or Canadians on either side, and then you're going to have those German army defenders on the beaches, or you're going to be American airborne against either German army or Fallschirmjäger on the west, and then you're going to have British army against the German infantry on the east. And then interestingly, if you pick one of those, then that really is going to kind of determine to what extent you're going to go with the terrain. Whether you're going to be in like the bocage heavy west, or you're going to be in the more open east. And then there's more of that heavy tank element to the east as well. So that would, for me, would be like, where is an individual's interest in the types of units that they want to go with, and then what would they like to represent on the table. And then once you figure that kind of out and have a rough idea of the forces that are available, and you make an excellent point, like the entry box is like, from so many people, at whatever scale you're going to do it. And I think that's the next point I'd say, make it so accessible. But for me, it would be like, what's that unit or what's that kind of fight? What's that pictorial image that maybe might spark it? Where is it? Who's involved in it? And then maybe take that thread and try and unwind it from there. I'd say for people starting out, I mean, Joe's spot on. The easiest way to get into it is, and Harry would probably get pilfered for this, like, but 28 minutes probably the most easily recognizable scale, I would suggest. Yeah, in terms of the scale of miniatures that are readily available for. And I think that's quite easily accessible then too, in terms of what you need to do. But if I was starting, straight off and I hadn't necessarily committed, I definitely would consider or tease out those questions about, like, where's my interest? Where does the interest lie? Is it in East or West? Is it with the Americans and the Germans, the British, Anglo-Canadians and the Germans? Is it tanks or is it infantry? And then what level do I really want to play at? Like, I think the platoon one is so perfect because it's such an easy in terms of, like, there's 3 sections and you have a couple of support weapons, maybe a vehicle or 2, and then you're playing. Like, that's it. You're playing. And I think that fire maneuver level type thing, where you're at that level of the game is again, maybe it's pretty intuitive, I would suggest, in terms of people who have some conception of what's happening, and then in terms of its links to other game systems or whatever. But definitely, like, and I'm saying this from personal experience, in that, like, I would have jumped way in at, like, the 28 mil platoon level, and then as I've gone through it, I found me adding other platoons and the game level coming up, and then you're, like, wondering about, like, well, maybe am I playing company plus or battalion minus, like, what type of game. And again, then you're looking at maybe different scales and stuff. So that can be a really interesting question to look at then. And it's one that I necessarily haven't asked myself previously before. But, like, what's the type of game that I want to play? What type of challenge do I want from it? And that's a really interesting question as well. But certainly I'd agree with Joe totally. The platoon level stuff, pick your area, and then it's really, the beauty of it is, how deep down the rabbit hole do you want to go, so to speak? Yeah. That's the thing. And I think anyone that's been listening so far will see, it's like, once you start down it tends to be a bit like a runaway train. All of a sudden we're building villages, whole villages and towns in Normandy, like, and that's the beauty. I mean, isn't that the beauty of it? If you can find, so when you start and it's all new, that's great. But if you can find that bit that hooks you, like, that totally hooks you, and I know I've said this to you before, and I've said it to Joe numerous times, like, for me in Normandy, that hook is all of that fighting, behind the causeways, around, the American 101st, 82nd, and then those German element defenders in that bocage heavy terrain, like around Carnta. That to me is, when we talk about Normandy, that for a bunch of reasons, that's where that's the center of gravity for me when we come back to Normandy, really. It doesn't matter what I go away and kind of flirt with in terms of other areas or elements or operations within Normandy. That's the bit that keeps drawing me back. The aesthetic of it, the elements of the forces that were involved, the challenges of it, the terrain and the challenges that the terrain brings. That's my hook. And it's been great. I suppose I'm very lucky to have found it and, to say, yeah, that's it. But I think that's important as well. And I think that people maybe find that naturally, maybe over time. It's not necessarily maybe immediately intuitive at the start. But yeah, I think that's how I would do it. Long story short, I would start with the forces. And then from the forces, everything else will flow out of that.
Well, that's interesting, because I've got a third suggestion. I don't think we're necessarily helping anybody here. I think it's, inevitably these things start from the historical hook, don't they? Any new project, there's got to be something that piques your interest enough to explore it further. And this isn't something that I have started to do until quite recently. But if I was to offer some advice, I would focus on that question around the type of game that you want to play. And I don't think it needs to necessarily be any more complex than just asking yourself, yeah, well, how many tanks do I want to put on the table at any one time?
Mm.
Because I think at that point, then, you know, if you say, well, actually, I want to put on 12 tanks. That's the type of game I want to play. Then inevitably, it's going to determine the type of scale.
Yeah, I do. I have like I do, you know, 28 millimeter. Sometimes I've got a lot of tanks on the table sometimes, you know. So don't
company of tanks at 28 mil. This is the way to do it.
Yeah,
Joe.
if you're listening,
Accept no
don't worry.
substitutes.
There's no limit on number of tanks, no matter what scale you play.
Yeah,
you can have as many tanks as you
and
want.
I will caveat this further by saying, like, the next major game being planned here, you know, with my gaming group is a battalion level 28 millimeter, not to be like, you know, with 3 or 4, and the table is 18 foot by, you know, 16 foot or whatever. So we're totally not ruining your point, Andrew, but maybe we are. But
I think you know, if you want to play Flames of War, I think that's a particularly pertinent point. The more tanks, the better.
Yeah.
So if you probably stack them one on top of the other, it would be kind of ideal, really. But no, I mean, I think it's this, you know, this sense of, you know, the type of game that you want to play, but also being aware that by changing scale, you can fight very, very similar battles, but have a very, very different experience.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so the example I'd give is around, you know, Chain of Command and Iron Shotman. So you've got a lot of mechanics that are quite common across the two games, and there's an evolutionary process that's gone on there to produce these two rule sets. But you've got the very, very kind of close, personal, intense kind of combat experience within Chain of Command that's still there within Iron Shotman, but all of a sudden you've got the opportunity to put, you know, tanks on the table in quite a number. You're using multiple elements around the table. You're fighting an altogether bigger battle and having a very different experience. But it might be set, you know, geographically in the same location and contemporaneously at the same time. But the gaming experience is completely different. And I think that question of what type of experience you want to have when you're playing is inextricably linked to the question of scale.
Yeah.
So, and one of the other important considerations around scale is making sure you've got enough people who are interested in doing it at the same scale that you want to do, because there's nothing more frustrating than setting off on a 2 millimeter Ancients project only to find that nobody's interested in playing it with you.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. No. Yeah, and that's a really interesting point as well, in terms of, like, you know, assuming you're going to want to be gaming it and it's not just a hobby collection project or, you know, like from that perspective. But yeah, you know, having an outlet to play that with others, in terms of, or easily play that with others, is going to drive that as well. But I think you make an excellent point. I think that discussion around what type of game do I want to play is an important one. Yeah, definitely. And I would say that belatedly, I learned that belatedly, I would say. Yeah, for sure.
And but obviously that also then feeds into decisions around types of rules as well. You know, so you know, again, yeah, we talked about our experiences and the types of games that we've been playing recently, and we're talking about beginning the new project, but we're also talking specifically about Normandy and the D-Day campaign. So, you know, what do you know, what are your preferences? What are your recommendations? You know, what have you enjoyed? What have you not enjoyed? If somebody was new to this period, where should they look for a set of rules?
Well, I'd say bot action is a really good, system. I do like. Most of my games are bot action that I've played, and I think that it's got some really good mechanisms in it for fast and well-flowing and exciting games. You know, you know, so obviously there's issues with, you know, like there's no morale tracking sort of thing for the whole force, right? So sometimes the games can end up being like like fight to the bitter end, even though you're not going to win, sort of thing, right? But aside from that, the actual rule set lets you get quickly into the game. It's easy to pick up. The firing is straightforward. The dice bag thing is a great. I really enjoy the potluck of, all right, you're desperate for your dice to come up, or you're desperate for not to come up because you don't want to have to act yet because there's no one on the table yet, sort of thing. And I found that it's because I got Bot Action. That was my first war game a few years back now, and my goal was because there wasn't really any clubs near me or anything and stuff. So I was like, well, I'll pick up this game. I'll get the two armies. So I got a British and a German army. So I wasn't trying to find someone else who had the opposite force to me in the same scale as me. I was, I'll provide all the stuff. I just need to find a person to play it. And my brother-in-law, who lives just like 5 minutes away, was like, yeah, I'll play. And so having a rule set there, he's entirely new to all war game type things and stuff. Having a rule set there that I could explain it to him in like 10 minutes, and then straight away he came around, and then straight away he's playing the game and understanding the game, and he's into it, and he's interested in, and he's enjoying the game, I think that if I had been a Chain of Command player as my only game, and I tried to get him into that from scratch, from having no sort of wargaming experience or sort of thing, I think that would be trickier. Especially since what I found so far in I've only played like 7 or 8 games of Chain of Command, but it can punish you more than Bolt Action does in terms of let's say you're playing and you lose a handful of leaders, or they get wounded, or your small bazooka support team of 2 blokes gets killed. Suddenly your morale's gone down, and you might 4 command dice or whatever sort of thing, and it can really strongly punish the play, right? And so obviously there's good tactical things there, the sort of challenge for you to avoid that, or how to deal with that if it happens. But for a new player who wants just to come in and be interested in playing war games and maybe want to go on to be a war gamer, I think Bot Action gave a lot of cinematic and exciting, well-balanced games from the scratch that meant that he was keen to keep coming back and playing again and again. And yeah, so that was good.
Yeah, no, excellent. I mean, what about you, Tom? What do you think?
Yeah, I come at this from a very similar angle to Joe. Like I would echo all of his points. I mean, I was playing 40k for 15 years, whatever it is, before I twigged that there was historical wargaming and really gave it a go. And Bolt Action was the first rule set that I picked up, and I actually split the box set with my dad, who has massive historical interest, probably where I draw mine from, but zero, and I mean zero wargaming experience, none. And I would have to say that the Bolt Action rule set, the game engine that's there, is pretty intuitive. It's very easy. It's fast flowing, and perhaps one of its greatest strengths, and maybe also its perhaps perceived weakness, is that there in some areas there is a lack of very gritty detail, which allows for it to be easily picked up and for it to flow relatively smoothly and quickly. And I think from my experience, I think it's an easy rule set to pick up. I think there's a degree of nuance to it that you need to master for sure. And I also feel, having tinkered with it a fair bit to expand it to company level and a few other bits with it, I think it's one of those rule sets whereby one of its greatest strengths is that you can allow it with relative ease, I would suggest, to make it as easygoing or as more realistic as you want to, without really stressing or breaking the rule set. I think, and I think for a new player, I think it's absolutely brilliant. I think it's a great rule set. I've never had a bad game of Bolt Action, ever, and I've played hundreds of games of Bolt Action. Both completely just off the rule set, and those that we've tweaked the rule set once we were new. So I definitely think, the dice bag mechanism, that not knowing who's going next, modeling that element of friction, is super. And then I think the allocation of the order dice to the unit, really great. Simple set of of quite, specific orders that you can give a unit that can allow, a relatively decent level in terms of command of units and getting their interactions right and whatnot. And I would never say a bad thing against it. I think it's a brilliant rule set, particularly for anyone starting off. Starting into Chain of Command, it's a very similar and yet very, very different experience. I think the level of, I said this earlier, the level of nuance and realism is its greatest strength. Like it is a different type of challenge altogether. Perhaps its greatest appeal is not necessarily the difficulty in mastering it, but the challenge in mastering it. And the fact that very, very small changes in any given game can have massive effects on it. So the replayability of it is huge. I would say, and I say this as a mark of credit to Rich and to Fat Lardies in terms of their rule set itself, is for me when I play Chain of Command, I think it's incredibly gritty. It's incredibly, it is like work. And I would teach, company, battalion, brigade level tactics through war games. Like we would practice those type of things. And I feel like, when we do those examinations and tests, like I almost feel like I'm doing a tute when I'm doing Chain of Command. Like it is, I am fully engaged in it. Because like Joe said, a simple mistake or an easy mistake within the context of a scenario or of a game, you can be punished really, 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 really heavily for that, as you would be in real life. Yeah. Okay. And I would say it's closer to a simulation rather than a representation of platoon level combat in the period, which is again one of its greatest strengths. Myself and Joe have approached it. I was wary of approaching it because I had played it and I was like, this is a whole other level of complexity. But myself and Joe have broken it down like over the last, 4 or 5 weeks, 6 weeks or so, give or take. And we've played a couple of very small games, and that was great. But even then, we stripped it back again, and we were like, okay, like there's a lot going on in a game. Let's just focus on one mechanic within the game. So let's just talk about close combat this evening. And the table could be empty, like with maybe one bit of bocage on it. And we just have a couple of models, and we're having a cup of tea talking about, okay, how does this thing work before we put it into context of a game? So it's happening in the context of a game. But yeah, I think it's brilliant. I think it's definitely, how I would pitch it is it's a step up. It's definitely a step up from bolt action in terms of the level of realism, the level of grittiness, the level of tactical options available to a player, particularly at a platoon level. And then outside of that, I'm afraid, like, I would really like to step up another level and say, look at them, some of those other rule sets, as you mentioned earlier in terms of maybe shot moments, stuff like that, where it's obviously the company level evolution of Chain of Command. Flames War is another one that I've heard of, but I haven't played it. And then of course there's the most recent, one of the most recent ones, but O Group as well, which I have the rule set for in a reading. But and again, that's at the smaller scale, battalion level stuff. Completely different level of challenge, but I haven't played it, so I can't comment. I think Alex maybe or somebody would be in a good position to talk about those. But yeah, that's how I would do it. I'd say from my experience, and this is only here, take it with a pinch of salt. I'd probably agree with Joe. I think bolt action is a brilliant intro for a complete novice into World War II wargaming. Brilliant. And then the other ones are a super evolution or expansion from there, and that's my view in terms of how I would approach it.
Well, I'm slightly different because I've never played bolt action before. I've got Warlords of Erewhon.
Oh yeah.
I enjoy. I've never played bolt action, and I came to historical wargaming via Flames of War.
Okay.
And the reason that I think I did that was because I found it quite familiar. It's often been described as historical 40k, and
right.
I think it is very much of that ilk. There were things that I found that resonated with my much younger, my time of playing things like 40k and Warhammer Fantasy Round, which was a very, very long time ago, a lot of the concepts and the mechanisms seem to translate quite readily to Flames of War. And I mean, and as an entry point, you are buying into, you know, the whole Battlefront world of pre-made, pre-painted terrain, the fantastic range of models and miniatures. Obviously, 15mm is a very generic and common scale anyway. You know, you're not kind of going down a particularly obscure size or scale to play the game. And Flames of War, I think, really facilitated my entry into historical wargaming. And I'm sure that new players to the period would find it incredibly helpful. The thing that I would say is, though, that, and I wonder whether it's the same to hear you talking about bolt action, was that when I played Flames of War, I had enjoyable games. Now that I play Chain of Command, what I'm finding is I'm having, this will sound really, really terrible, I'm having war game experiences now. You know, the act of participating in the game is in and of itself enjoyable, but it's so much more multifaceted than just having a good game. You know, I can remember one of the first games I played with my friend Nigel. We just had a throwdown game of Chain of Command, and we were finding our way around the rules. And I ended up in a position where my attack just completely collapsed, not because of force morale or casualties particularly, but what Nigel did was very fortunately killed all of the junior leaders that I had. So my force morale held up, but I had no way of executing my plan or getting my troops to do anything other than their fire and move, you know, and they kind of taught me that actually that experience, you know, was really, really quite subtle and really quite powerful, because that sense of immersion that it created, that feeling, well, actually, that's really quite a realistic portrayal of how that might have played out. But we're not just here to bang the drum about Chain of Command all the time. I'd like to suggest some other alternatives as well. I ain't been shot one. We'd already mentioned. For me, it's one of my favourite Lardy games. I think it's fantastic. And another game that I think is well worth looking at if you want to try and play those high-level games is Blitzkrieg Commander as well, which is based around kind of War Master type mechanisms around command and control, with a very much focus on maneuver, but focus much more on those high-level games where you're moving away from a model representing a single vehicle to maybe more of an element-based game where a base of vehicles would, a vehicle might represent 2 or 3 vehicles. And again, moving possibly up towards divisional level gaming at that scale. So again, those would be my suggestions. I think one of the great things about this period is that there's no shortage of fantastic rule sets. I think in many respects it's probably hard to, I don't know. I'd like to say it would be hard to pick a bad one, but I don't know. Maybe that's just, I've been very fortunate in my experience today. I don't know.
What's it's good too as well though is with everyone investing in virtual gaming over the last year or so, is that there's a lot of opportunities now really to try those rule sets without having to commit to buying. Otherwise before you have to spend a load of money, buy the 2 armies, buy the terrain, get it all painted up and everything. Right now, let's try it. Oh, I don't even like this game. I'm stuck with this stuff now, right? But there's no end to people. If you go onto the Too Fat Larry Discord channel thing, there's people organizing games in all scales all the time. So if you wanted to go and try something where you're playing a company level game or a battalion level game or whatever, or you can try all those things out. You can have endless games really, and then you could go, actually this sort of does work for me in that sense. That's what I was thinking, that when you were sort of talking about like the levels of the games and stuff, and your earlier question about about how you like approach the combined armed element of Operation Overlord type stuff, is that you could, if you were either playing it virtually and therefore had access to lots of different rule sets and scales, you could do a sort of game where, with NumPy maybe, you play on a high level game first, right? So you're playing like battalion levels, or even if you want to do like army level sort of thing, right? So and there you could really bring in the combined arms element sort of thing, right? So some sort of rule set that will let you model the impact of fighter bomber incursions over the beaches and stuff, or bomber raids hitting rail yards back in Normandy, affecting movement of Germans and stuff. And then you could zoom in on actions, right? So you could go, right, okay, we're going to play this, we're going to play O group or whatever, and here I've got this this battalion or this brigade or whatever level sort of dealing with O group stuff, and they're capturing this little village, right? And that's like on that game, that's just one action on a big board, one little minor thing. But it might be a really interesting, you might decide that instead of contesting and working out who wins that particular thing using the O group rules, whatever, we're going to decide that with chain of command. And then you're going to zoom into that and play a game of chain of command where the position and the troops you've got determined by how your broader scale things approach that game, that area in the first place. And then you decide to go with that and you play that game, and depending on how you win, that then feeds into that. And obviously it wouldn't necessarily be practical to do all of them, or you could. Now think about it, you could farm out, if you had enough people, you could farm out every major battle or conflict or skirmish even on like an O group scale game, and you could say, right, we're going to run 10 chain of command games, right? So during this first turn of O group, whatever, there's been conflict here, 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 and here, and here. I mean, 5 tables, 5 people. Can you play these games out and tell us how that goes, right?
Yeah.
Then you're able to play big scale stuff and do your big grand maneuvers where you're moving whole regiments up, and and sort of like doing whole divisions of capturing areas and stuff. But you're also able to zoom into that personal level, because I actually quite enjoyed the personal level of the sort of platoon level games and stuff where you have like your plucky sergeant, and you sort of like, our games, Tom, with Corporal Jones, right?
Corporal Jones and his damned Piat.
And his Piat, right? And I've played against Corporal Jones, and I've also played as Corporal Jones, right? And having that gritty level of because I had Corporal Jones playing a game, and Corporal Jones was up in this farmhouse window, right?
Oh, the 223, wasn't it?
Yeah, or was it the Puma? Puma?
No, it was the 233
on the bridge, right?
233.
On the bridge. Yeah, and like I was like, oh come on, Corporal Jones, and he was firing his P out, and he like glanced off it or something, and then there was returned fire, and I was like, please.
Fritz, the sniper, took a shot at him. He missed.
Yeah, he missed him.
The Piat round went straight into the turret on the next one.
Exactly,
and that was it. The German attack stopped.
Exactly, and then they turned tail. Right? I was so pleased for Corporal Jones there. So having that level of scale where you're down to like your particular officers, or you sort of know the team and you want that team to do well, and then being able to marry that up with a broader game where you're able to also go, okay, look, I'm doing a daring maneuver. My whole division is going to move up, come around this hill, right? And obviously you don't care about sort of Corporal Jones is in there somewhere, but you're not actually tracking those things, right? But that's quite a nice way to sort of bring that in. Obviously it needs someone to be sort of coordinating it, really. But that's, and that I don't want to end up inadvertently volunteering myself. This is how.
Is that not what you just did, Joe?
I don't know. I think it might be too late.
I was like, I'm taking notes here. Yeah, that's next year's project.
I think it's recorded anyway, isn't it? So
yeah, that's it for posterity's sake. So we can go back and we can go, well, you said on whatever the 22nd of July that we were doing it. Well,
wouldn't it be good? It'd be good though. I think it would be the sort of thing you could do on a sort of like on a virtual server thing, like a sort of Discord thing. And
I think that's there's a couple of ways you could do this. And I think that's brilliant. I absolutely love that idea that you can play a battalion or a regimental level assault across X amount of kilometers deep. And then within that assault, you have company level engagement, you've battalions, you've companies, and then it's going to come down to the pointy end, which is like that one barn or one Norman farmstead, if that's where we're still situating ourselves, that's being held by a German platoon or a Canadian platoon or whatever it is. And there's 5 or 6 of these actions occurring across this regimental assault. And that you could have a set of players, to let's say myself and Joe or myself and Andrew, right, that are playing a game of whatever O group, whatever the level of rule set is, and that they're playing, and it's timestamped. So in the first move, this happens, and then at the point of contact, there is number 1 platoon of a company of a 1st battalion bumps into whatever at that farmstead. And you could press pause. And then simultaneously, there's 2 or 3 other happens. There is a troop of tanks of Churchills run into an ambush of whatever. And then you could press pause. And then you could farm those engagements out to a team of like-minded individuals and say, right, Joe, Andrew, you're doing number 1 platoon, A company, 1 battalion is taking that farmhouse at 28 mil. And name the characters. And Joe has just hit on, like, from my perspective, one of the most important rules of wargaming: name the characters. It instantly makes it 150% more immersive, because Corporal Jones or Sergeant Barnes or Lieutenant whoever it is, that's where we're at. And that you could play it out. And then once the results of those games has been come in, let's say the Germans, stout German defense has held that, well, then that result is fed back in through some game mechanism to the main game that you're playing, and you could do it. And I think that's a really, really good way of doing it. Alternatively, and here I've done this on 1 or 2 games, whereby you have 15, 20 people in the one room, and the table is massive, and there is in effect 4 or 5 simultaneous games occurring on the same table, in which the umpire or the games master or the script master has interacted and interconnected all of these individual games. So for instance, at one end of the table, there is a platoon of German grenadiers defending the guns a la Breakorman. And there is a platoon plus of American paratroopers seeking to destroy the guns. And those self-same guns, let's say 4 of them arbitrarily, are a German asset that the player on the other end of the table, who's defending whatever town or beach or whatever it is, he has the availability to utilize the fires of those guns for as long as they are still in play on that table. And they are scripted into the rules of the game that's being played on another side. Now, we've come down a level. We may have come down a level. We could be playing company plus battalion minus whatever it is across a much more expansive physical area, together at the same time. You're still trying to interwove those elements together. That's another way of doing it. But I think Joe's idea is, I think the level of organization required for that, and obviously the logistical requirements for it is quite significant. But as an experiment, if we were to corral enough people, I think that could be a really interesting one.
What's nice about it as well, I think, is that as in the case of like real historical accounts during any war really, your top generals and stuff, they have these great plans, right? And they're doing this great maneuver, and I've caught them on the back foot, and they don't see me coming. I'm going to move my troops around this bit here. They'll never. And then on the day at
Corporal Jones
point, one particular, look, actually this section of soldiers didn't break. This section held off this whole thing, and as a result of it, it meant that the attack failed. And on paper, yes, of course they're going to win because they've got all these heavy tanks coming through and whatever and stuff. But the actual particular circumstances of it meant that it didn't. And obviously, if you were doing the rules, you'd have to sort of make sure that you accurately conveyed the sort of situation, so that if it is a great maneuver where the Germans have outflanked the Brits and they have caught them by surprise, then you suitably do things like, okay, well, the British morale is low, or their support's low, or the German got more support, or the morale's high, or they get to move, or whatever some sort of mechanism for reflecting that. But that still allows you then the chance that on the day at the sort of like at the sharp end, getting a little the campaign or thing. That's where actually something unpredictable happens. The actions of a few people end up affecting a broad scale thing, and then now when you go back to the sort of bigger level game, well, my plan didn't work, and now I've got to deal with that because I thought I'd capture that town. I didn't capture that town. Now what do I do? My troops in the wrong place, or the timing's wrong because these guys are unsupported now because they were hoping they were going to get through in time. And that's quite interesting to. I might have to think about whether at a less busy time I work out a way of running that. That'd be quite good.
Well, I've got a suggestion.
Go.
Well, first of all, I just want to say, I think you've also, for new play, you've touched on an interesting point around the role of the umpire. I think that a good umpire to help players understand, interpret the rules, and to provide a helpful guiding hand in a kind of a friendly and welcoming manner is just so important. And I think one of the nice things about virtual gaming is that in many instances, it requires you to have an umpire. And I think that that's an enormous bonus right from the start. But I also, the second point was just, I spoke to Andy Crow some weeks ago about Kriegspiel. And Kriegspiel is obviously fantastic at capturing all of those kind of macro and strategic factors that typically lie outside of your tabletop wargame. So those instances of marshalling your reserves, putting your reinforcements in the correct place, questions of logistics, in a D-Day context, managing the collapse of the French rail network to marshal your forces and to have them in the appropriate time to make a counterattack or not, as the case may be. But typically, Andy was explaining that the actual combat within Kriegspiel, often his games will end at that point. That the entire focus is around the organisation, the manoeuvre, all of those other aspects that don't typically factor into the tabletop experience. And it just struck me that could be a perfect mechanism to capture those higher level type of issues that you're discussing, Joe. You could, in a D-Day type context, you could well imagine the Germans counter-attacking across the Orne. The tabletop could be the battle around the bridges, Pegasus Bridge, and the brave paratroopers defending against 21st Panzer Division. But the Kriegspiel element of it could be, the German player trying to muster those reserves to assemble sufficient force at the appropriate time to actually conduct the operations, and the Allied player being very interested in, liaising with the French resistance, trying to disrupt the transport links, interdict the movement to the battlefield. And you could well imagine that Kriegspiel would be a really appropriate mechanism to kind of blend all those factors. But then instead of stopping when the combat is reached, that's the point at which you zoom into the tabletop and you actually play the game out to a decision on the tabletop.
I haven't played with Andy. Having played one of you're spot on. It's about, on the map, it's about maneuvering to a point in time and space whereby one side has an advantage, and then we launch into the actual what happens. I think you could definitely do what you're suggesting, but I think it would be interesting to kind of meld what Joe was saying insofar as you would dive onto the table, but then you would come back from the table. Insofar as my understanding is that the Kriegspiel ones I've done is that you get to the point in time and space where you've landed on the battlefield, where the engagement will be fought, and then that's kind of where you stop. But it would be really interesting to land onto that battlefield at that farmstead or that village, to play that out and then to bring that result back to the map.
Mm.
Yeah.
So the narrative's ongoing.
Correct and true. Yeah, correct and true. And so that it then continues, because really, you know, the bit where, you know, to some degree, I mean, but to take the map thing, it will play itself out. But the bit where we get to the table, and this is between us then, between the players of the game, the bit where we get to the table is surely where the degree of chance or degree of the probability goes right out the window in terms of the amount of things that could happen over the course of that game, that will then influence how the map then goes, particularly if it's been played multiple times, as Joe was suggesting, whereby we would have engagements across a number of areas. And that this then would be run over a number, you know, from a real world perspective, it's going to be run over a not inconsiderable period of time. But yeah, that's a really interesting one to see. I think what Joe was kind of saying is that we would have one master table. I think this, what you're proposing is, like, again, you can set it whatever level you want, but like if we were going to scale this way up, okay, we could do it on a map. Whereas if we were doing the like O group-esque type battalion brigade type thing on a table, so there is a master table where that's being played out. And then we're zooming off to whatever other tables then for the independent bits as they occur on the master table. Yeah, that's an interesting one. But you're I'm just thinking it through. Kriegspiel thing in terms of the map-based master map, or the campaign map, whatever we want to call it. That has real merit, I would suggest. Normandy type Kriegspiel. Wheels are turning here now. No, they're turning, Joe. We need to get ourselves some maps and some PowerPoint symbols, I think.
Yeah, I mean, a really kind of interesting sort of touch point for that is the Scharnhorst system in Blue Shirt, which is Mustafa's set of rules. And although it's Napoleonic, the principle of having your operational map and then zooming into the tabletop is very much a feature of that game, and that's something that, you know, just for that aspect of it alone, it might be worth looking at Blue Shirt for, because it's something that would translate across periods. It's not it's not specifically a Napoleonic concept, is it?
You've just opened a whole other Pandora's box, Andrew. You know that now. We're going to feel like going looking for maps in Normandy and our military stencils. And I think that's so. What really, I mean, what we're talking about here in terms of is about adding that additional layer of, I won't say complexity, but that additional layer of detail in terms of above it, whereby you're trying to take these smaller level actions, and trying to extract more relevance from them, more import from them in terms of telling a broader picture.
Narrative, you're making them, you know, you can play a little platoon level game and say, well, this is part of this operation, but and even if you do like a 4 or 5 table short campaign thing where you're following this platoon's action sort of thing, you're still only seeing that platoon's part of a bigger story. Whereas if you were to sort of meld it with a sort of broader level, operational level thing, you're able to sort of see, do you know what, like, it's quite fun to sort of think, you know, like my divisional level operation here failed because I didn't take that bridge in this town, you know, and I didn't take it, you know, I haven't played like O group and stuff, so I'm not sure exactly what the mechanics are for how you deal with like combat between two things, right? Between like two groups and things, but it's not going to be as close detail as in Chain of Command, right? So it will abstract a lot of those things that will then and so you might go, oh, yeah, I failed to take that, I didn't capture that town. That's the result of that combat there. Whereas if you played that action in Chain of Command, you got the fun thing of thinking like, well, I didn't get it because I didn't use the cover properly, and my tanks, they came on too early and they didn't have support, and then that narrative then means that you might affect how you approach other things. You might think, okay, you know what, actually, I didn't use armor very well in that town. I'm not going to use my armor here now. I'm going to, and you've got that sort of extra level, and you've got the buy-in for players as well. If you do farm this out to people and you say, all right, can you play this game? they've got this great narrative. You can say, look, beforehand, what's happened so far is they've done this, they've captured here, you're the last defense, they've got this here, they are moving around this side. That, you know, it's really important that your guys hold this or capture this, or don't get all, you rescue the supply lorries or whatever. And then that gives them a real narrative that they're playing, you know, and they know that their results in their game directly feed into a bigger story than just their little action.
I would think one of the things that, the reason that I suggested the Kriegspiel approach is that it helps. I think it's a very good way of including very, very kind of complex influences that you couldn't hope to capture in a written rule set. I mean, how would you, for example, create a mechanism that might represent, you know, the involvement or the intervention of the French resistance, you know, very kind of asynchronous style of warfare. You know, it's very, very abstract. And the other interesting thing that I'd also like to suggest is that it also lends itself to trying to capture some of the politics of the coalition. Yeah, you could well imagine, so for example, Tom is the Canadian brigadier and Joe, you're the British brigadier, and you could have a very different briefing to Tom, you know, reflecting the politics and the nuances within the coalition and how that communication occurred. Yeah, and maybe from a German perspective, you know, somebody could be the commander of a garrison division with a lot of Georgian troops and Ostfront levy in his division versus somebody who's maybe playing, you know, Panzer Grenadier Division or a Panzer Division, and their experience of the same game would be very, very different based on, you know, the quality of the troops, how they perform the tasks they're asked to carry out. I think there's so much potential.
I think it's fascinating if you just, as you were describing that, like to see how the discussion has segued and yet come full circle. So earlier you posed the question, well, what type of a game do you want to play? Yeah, like, you know, we said platoon level, whatever it is. And then as we've started discussing about all the various elements that are at play at varying different levels and the elements, and yet really how they're all yet still interconnected, right? And then we're talking about how we would go about taking those ideas, things that clearly, for whatever reason, we would have an interest in trying to understand. You know, you've just identified there, Andrew, the political dynamic or the individual's dynamic or the national dynamic. Yeah. And then very quickly, within the space of a sentence or two, we're then thinking about, well, that's really interesting. How would we get a mechanism to model that dynamic within a game? And then we've started talking about, like, what type of game do we want to play? And now we're talking, really what we're actually discussing is how we would design a game that would encapture all the various elements that we would like. And really what we're saying as well, we're going to use this type of rule set and this type of rule set, and that's really good. But yet how can we merge them together? How can we make them more interconnected? And I think we're then tending towards maybe, I mean, what we've described, I think is fascinating. Even from a running it perspective, I think would be fascinating. From trying to figure out how we take the results of what Joe was talking about at that lower level of trying to take the bridge with the employment of armor, and the result of that specific game between two people on a specific table, and then how we take the result of that and then model that into the broader game to have an effect that will influence what's happening at a level. And then simultaneously try and take other elements that we're not modeling in any way, shape, or form. For instance, your French resistance, for instance, yeah, and look at that element and say, clearly this is an element that we think should be involved. Where is it going to have the influence? How can we model that influence in the game so that it is recognizable, that it is of import, yeah, and that it will fit with the rest of what's going on? And I think it's fascinating to try and wrestle with that. I mean, from the practical perspective of how would we write it, but then even more so, identifying the elements that we think would be great to put in it. Because I think you're right. I think you're spot on. All of those elements of national characteristics, national direction or considerations or history or background are going to be have of import at that level. Personalities at levels are going to have, you know, an import. And how would we model that? What level should we model it? Yeah, or should it be put in? I think as a singular example, I think is a fascinating. But I think what we've come full circle, we're actually almost designing a game in its broadest brushstrokes.
So I like how the initial question was how would you get a new player into the game, and we've got on to no, don't get that. Just design your own game.
Yes, yeah. Stitch all these multiple issues together.
What rule set would you recommend? I recommend combine them all into a hyper complex entire World War II game. Why stop there? Why don't we have what's happening in the Pacific as well? Right, let's have
and we could. There's a game that does that, Joe. We could definitely do that. If there's not, we could design one, my friend.
Let's have industrial simulator where we model how many tanks we can produce. Let's have coal mining simulator where we have a rule set that how much coal we get.
I'm totally on board for this, but I think the point there though is that not the greatest, one of the greatest strengths it is that you once you start at a point zero somewhere, and it can run to wherever you want it to go, depending on whatever your level of interest is at. And there are ways, when you sit down and think about it, of merging any of those levels, if you want. Yeah. And I think that's in so much of the fun. Once you get to grips with it, I think that's where the real fun really lies. So basically, what we are saying though is, self and Joe and yourself, we're going to have to sit down and figure this thing out. And Joe, you're definitely leading this from the front, my friend. You're like the Italian level. We finish this, and the next private message will be like, right, we need to purchase some smaller scale miniatures and a whole other world of. Look at it this way, Joe. It's a whole other world of terrain to start into.
At least it'll all fit in a small box.
And this is it. It'll all fit into one box, you know.
But the problem is, you need so much more of it when you're playing at small scale.
This is true. I guess this is true.
Well, I mean, I think it raises another very interesting point, a psychological point about wargamers' megalomania.
The term black hole gets thrown around an awful lot. Like, and I definitely would be guilty of not even walking into it, diving into it head first. Yeah, like it is, but it's a function of everything, really, Andrew. Once you start into something and you start to enjoy it, you know, you're going to run with it as best possible. Certainly when you have, you know, I'd have to say this, you say about the you know, our corner of Twitter or whatever you call it, like, but there has been nothing other than, you know, people that are just bend over backwards to help you out or to give information or whatever. And Joe's made the point, like earlier, virtual gaming and assisting people are offering people the opportunity to try games that they would never have had the opportunity to do so without significant risk and an expenditure on their own behalf. Like, I mean, that's been brilliant, like, you know, in terms of different scales, different periods and everything, like, and really broadening people's wargaming horizons. Like, from my own perspective, like, since January, you know, it's a 180-degree arc in terms of where you can go with wargaming on the basis of the time and effort and patience that people have given me and opportunities they've afforded us. So I think it's imminently doable. And particularly when so many people would help you to get there, or to help you to kind of find your way, you know.
Well, I think we might have set ourselves a little challenge there. Then.
It's recording, isn't it? So then if it's not written down, it never happened. I think if we said it happened. So, like, you know, that's where we're stuck. You know.
Well, so look, so that's been a very interesting but completely unplanned tangent.
Best way to have it.
Well, we've gone down, which hopefully people will find interesting.
And if they have any suggestions, Andrew, that we're wildly on or off the mark, or they think where we could go with it, or to give us any further guidance, we're all ears, electronically speaking.
Absolutely. Any negative comments, direct them directly to Tom on Twitter. That would be much appreciated. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, no worries.
So I'm going to kind of bundle up the next sort of questions that I've got, because as I say, this was a bit of an unplanned diversion. So we've talked about rule sets, we've talked about scale. What about the gaming experience? What constitutes a good game? How important is it for the experiences that we try to recreate on the tabletop to be historical? Is it a nice to have, or is it an essential element of what we're trying to do? And it's obviously a question of degree, but what do you think, Joe?
I think what I want from the game is I want to enjoy playing the game, which is an important thing. I like to have fun and have a laugh with it. I also like the game to look nice and feel cinematic and feel. So I like getting down like on eye level, with the table sort of thing, and like looking down little lanes and stuff, and like seeing my guys sticking up their heads around there, hello, and that sort of stuff. And I also like then the tactical challenges from the game and things. And I like historical. As in, I wouldn't play unrealistic matchups, right? So I would never play like a US versus Russia what if sort of thing, right? Or I wouldn't have Germans versus Japanese sort of thing. I wouldn't like mix up my pairings like that, right? I want realistic pairings, but I don't always play like historical encounters like based on real ones, but they are also, I do like to sort of then have it generally be historical sort of thing. So I sort of like to go, okay, I'm playing a game where I don't just grab random terrain and go, right, I'm just playing a random game. Who is it today? Oh, it's them versus them. I sort of think, okay, I want to play a game where this is up somewhere near near Dunkirk, right? And so then, okay, I'll pick a suitable French force and a suitable German force, and it might not be based on a particular recorded action around that thing, but it will be a typical force for those things, and a sort of encounter that could have happened somewhere along in the whole thing. So I think what I want from the game is I want it to be fun. I want to tactical challenges and stuff. I want the game to look nice, and to evoke a sense of like being there almost, sort of thing. And also I like just to use my minis as well, so because I don't paint just to paint the minis. I paint them because I want to use them in the games, and stuff. Although, do you know what, to be fair though, I actually spend probably more time building terrain than the number of hours that goes into building terrain and stuff. But that's because I actually have discovered that the terrain building thing is a little sub hobby within it anyway, and I really enjoy just building the buildings. Using them is a bonus and it's really fun, and I like using them and stuff, but I do also like just taking an MDF kit, working on it, painting it and weathering it and stuff, and at the end going, oh look, I've got this nice little house to move into. Yes, that's my
Well, I personally think you've got a lot to answer for, Joe, because I used to be quite happy with my old 2D terrain until I started following your stuff on Twitter, and now I feel really inadequate. So Tom, same question to you then.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think it's a question of degrees, really, isn't it? And everyone slots where they want it. For my overriding point is like it's time, and time is the single most valuable thing that any of us has. So if and I would suggest certainly, the amount of time it takes to set a table up and take it down and get ready, is like it's an investment in time. Yeah. So like if I or anyone that I'm hosting for or playing with like is going to devote 3 or 4 or 2 or whatever hours to it, I want to be able to walk away from it and say I actually enjoyed that. That was a bit of crack. It was a bit of fun. I enjoyed get to roll my dice and all the rest of it. And that's the start point. So that comes down to, having the right atmosphere in terms of approaching the game from the same perspective with other people and stuff like that. So yeah, so I want to enjoy what I'm doing first and foremost. Yeah. Where that enjoyment comes from, I'd be very much like Joe. I'm a historian by academic trade, I suppose. So yeah, the history element of it is important to me. And I would suggest that I am probably leaning towards the historical representation of something as opposed to the historical simulation of something. And I would draw a distinction between the two there. But there are certain elements where I would try and make sure that I'm broadly on the mark in terms of, correct assets available at a time and place, the correct type of force, that there's broadly representative of what was there. Or there may be a certain thing that I'll see a photograph of and I'll say, yeah, I want to simulate that. That's the bit that grabbed my interest. I'm going to make sure that whatever else happens, that element of whatever I'm looking at is on the table, and then I'll fill out the rest around it. So I would find myself, the needle oscillating between that representation, simulation, and trying to find an enjoyable balance between the two. Moderation in all things. So that's kind of how I would approach that element of it. I certainly find myself spending a lot of time thinking about the game, more so than I probably end up playing the game, to be honest with you, in terms of trying to figure out how I want it to look, what I'm trying to take away from it, how I think I would balance it up. And actually, I've spent an awful lot of time over recent months moderating games or running games, not playing the games, but running the games. So creating the games, creating the scenario, the conditions, victory conditions for both sides, and trying to find the balance between them whilst situating them in a time and space. And if you ever read my after action reviews on Twitter, like I'll always say the date, the time, the location, and that just puts a time, that situates it in it. And then everything else after that is what happened in the game, but it was situated from that and broadly draws inspiration from what was happening in that place. And I think those are kind of, from my perspective, those are key elements to what I would like to take away from it. Like, one, needs to be enjoyable. Two, it's a historical game. It's World War II wargaming. It draws its inspiration from a historical event. And then I sit somewhere on that oscillating scale in terms of finding a happy medium between the historical accuracy of what I'm dealing with versus the gaming element of what I'm doing and what I want to take away from it. Because I think if you go to the extreme of either, well, then that's not me. I would generally try and find a halfway house on most things. So like you're trying to find the two, but a happy medium between the two. And where I can sit on those mediums will vary. I would tend to be far more dogmatic about the force composition and weapons allocation and markings and stuff like that on the troops than I would necessarily be, and I know Joe will kill me, but on the terrain elements of it, like representing the exact square mile on what I'm fighting on, as long as it's broadly representative of where I am, I'd be happier. Because like, I guess I'm a soldier, like I'm an officer, like, yeah, I was like the unit, the weapons, the kit, the organization, the equipment, that's where my personal interests would lie, whilst noting the fact that the terrain is really important and trying to somewhat represent that. But I would be, I'd be honest, if I'm going to be dogmatic, it would be more on the units, the equipment, that type of style, and representing that than the terrain. But overall, yeah, broadly representative, draws inspiration from historical events that leads then to our translating it to the table and seeing how that goes and trying to play it out so much that it's enjoyable. Like we get every aspect of it. I enjoy the research part of the hobby, the books, all of the research thing myself and Joe bought like recently on Normandy and stuff for various elements, digging around in that, conceptualizing how I would take that historical reading and stuff and then go, how is this going to look in the table? How do I want this to look on the table? This is my table, or our table and then what do we want to take from it? And then how would we set it up so that we're kind of finding that happy medium between all of that? It's not always easy. Sometimes I get it right. Sometimes I don't get it right. And I only learned that I haven't gotten it right when I I walk away from it afterwards and have a think about it. And I find doing those after action reviews on Twitter, like, that they're great for thinking back over how things went, how the game played out from a practical, tactical perspective. What were the key elements of the game? Because we're learning from the game. I think wargaming is a brilliant educational tool from a military perspective. That's me with my hat on, my beret on, saying, yeah, okay, and then I will learn lessons to extract from that. But then also from like how I ran the game, how I approached the game, did I have the right I think there's a lot to that. But yeah, some 8 fun, find the right balance between the 2 elements of it, and off you go. How about you?
Yeah, no, I'm in agreement. I'm not an exclusively historical wargamer, but when I play historical games, I like to feel that I am trying to capture the essence of that period as closely as I can.
Yeah.
But having an enjoyable experience always takes primacy over that. But having said that, I find it very easy to reconcile, historical accuracy with enjoyment, because I enjoy that side of the hobby. I suppose the other thing as well I was just going to say was, one of the elements that I think is really important in a good game is a compelling narrative.
Yes.
And I think that goes back to your comments earlier about the importance of giving your soldiers names. And I also, if there is someone new to the hobby listening to this, I would also say, campaign games are fantastic for developing that narrative and playing a series of interlinked games where the consequences of what happens on one table affect what happens in the next game just adds a completely new and additional dimension to the hobby. It is the sort of thing that if you are playing a series of interlinked games, you find yourself thinking about at 3 o'clock in the morning while you're laying in bed and you can't sleep. And that, and if you enjoy that sort of thing, that's great fun, obviously.
Yes, I think you're spot on. I think the narrative element of it is key as well. Like, and naming, what was that game, the Tank Wars game that we played, Joe, on the Silo Heights? We Lieutenant von Egan and his Panzer his Panther against holding off. And we were playing the game, and about after turn 1, I think Joe said, like, that's you. Which one is you? I was like, which one is me? He was like, yeah, that's you.
Yeah, that's it. You were the Command Panther.
You're the Command Panther.
I went out of my way to blow him up.
And like,
kill von Egan. He is
2.5 hours later, we were still telling an epic narrative of tank conflict on the Silo Heights. And that was largely driven, like, the result of the game didn't matter. Who won or lost didn't matter. It instantly became about the exploits of our two characters on the table. No different to, poor Joe's long-running saga dealing with Corporal Jones or Sergeant Barnes and their respective Piat or bazooka or whoever the pesky German gunner is with the light howitzer, the infantry assault gun who keeps blowing, people's out of the top window of whatever Norman house that they're in. And it makes it from the enjoyable factor. I would personally say, and I echo your comments there, Andrew, I think it just makes it the narrative naming element of it instantly changes the dynamic around the game, the atmosphere around the game. It's top tip. Name the character.
But maybe it's this kind of, again, at the risk of sounding too kind of metaphysical, maybe it's this idea of two willing participants coming together and the enjoyment of creating that combined narrative. Because obviously part of the enjoyment is that it's a collaborative endeavor with somebody else who's similarly obsessed with historical wargaming, isn't it? And it's that shared experience, I think.
That's true. I say that, it's nice then, like, when people have spent hours researching accurate schemes for this T-34 is wearing the right colors for Leningrad, sort of thing, right? Playing against someone that will be as interested in schemes on tanks or you know, oh look, you know, I've done a kit bash. Look, I've turned these guys are carrying this uniform. Oh, cool. And someone else to recognize why that's a worthwhile thing to do. You know, you go, I spent £400 getting this army so I could do this one battle, right? And I've got these tanks. I had to order them specially, and I painted them all perfectly for this one encounter, right? And if the person just goes, "You weirdo, why have you done that?" right? But they don't, because they're like, "That's so cool. I do the same thing," you know. And it is definitely, you know, I think the sort of like nicheness of the hobby and the sort of geekiness of the hobby, and the fact that the people that are into it are like really into it, right? They're really into their history and really into accuracy of, you know, you think you paint your minis, right? And you paint. I was painting Japanese soldiers last week, and I was painting. I had ages researching, trying to find like the rank, like the flashes and stuff on like officers, on Japanese officers and stuff. Like, well, is it different if they're on the islands versus Burma, and is it different if they're wearing? So I was doing like loads of research and stuff just so that I had the correct little yellow mark right on their shoulders, like a tiny millimeter dot. And I was glad that I had them with these dots, because I thought, well, now I know they're accurate, right? But knowing that if you were playing in person with someone, right, and they wouldn't think, "You weirdo, why have you done that? That's obsessive," because they'd be like, "Oh yeah, cool, I do that as well." You know, I bought 14 books and spent £100 just to see what color their trousers were accurately. You know, and I used to, in like a previous life, I used to do flight sim, L2 flight sim skins, right? So I used to like make the textures for the flight sim, and it started as a little hobby bit of going, oh, I'll make a couple of textures and stuff. And then I thought, oh, I want to make them accurate, right? So in the end, I had, I don't know, like 500 books. I had like things with like original color chips and stuff of like all the RLM colors and things, and I had black and white photographs of everything, and I had like color analyze them and stuff. And I did loads of research about how like black and white German film the grades, and how to spot RLM4 yellow in black and white photographs, and that sort of stuff, right? And it was just so that when I did these textures that I then just played on my own flight sim with, right, I knew that the color yellow on those wingtips was the right yellow, you know. And so I think the community of like wargamers and stuff who share that level of obsession with the campaigns and but even if it's not a campaign or a theater that you play, you still recognize it in other people, and you go, you know. So I don't play in Napoleonics, right? But when I see people's paintings of Napoleonics and they're like super detailed, and they've taken the care to go, right, this is the right flag for them, or this is the right color on their helmets, or their cross pieces on their bandoliers, you know, and you see that and you recognize that the effort that they've done into it, and the attention and the passion for that and stuff, and that's what you want. You know, you're playing against people that you know are going to appreciate what you've done. I think that's a really other thing about Twitter as well. Sort of like wargaming corner of Twitter is that you know, people will like put their pictures of their minis and their tanks and their building tables, and you know, people are genuinely saying like, that's a great table, right? It's not just a case of like platitudes, and people are seeing it and they go, that's really cool, right? And even if it's not an area you play in, you recognize the effort that's gone into it and the time's gone into it, and you recognize the obsession with, you know, the why someone would want to collect an accurate army with those bits and stuff, and why people bother spending hours doing conversions to get the right hat on someone, you know, because you do it yourself. And so in on Twitter and stuff, you see a lot of people sort of going, oh yeah, that's a great table, or that's a great scene, and they mean it. They actually think this is really great, this is a really good thing, and you've done a good thing. You were saying, Tom, about time being such an important thing, right? But like, what an important thing to use your time to do stuff that you actually care about and enjoy, you know. And what a privilege to be able to have time to to go. So it's a time heavy hobby, right? Wargaming and stuff, which is probably why it's all like people who either are retired or at a point where they can spend enough time, money, doing that, right? It's a great privilege, right? But it's a great thing to think that that you've got you can spend part of your life like diving into that like never-ending deep pool of, and go, right, I'm going to research this, and I'm going to spend months researching this thing here, right? And that becomes an enjoyable thing in itself, and and then you spend hours painting the minis, and you know what? It doesn't even matter if you spent hours painting the minis and they only get played for like an hour over a whole year, right? Like my Hungarian army that I spent ages painting, they've had one game, right?
And I remember it. I know the exact scenario you played. It was number one in the Budapest book.
Yeah.
Because the table looked awesome.
It was so cool, right? It was so cool. It was the I put them all up, and they were all put, and I researched the Hungarian camo because
the green is different.
Yeah,
it's slightly different, right?
Like weird. They sort of like use it's almost like the same color patterns on their vehicles and stuff, on their uniforms, right? I researched all this and I found the right colors and everything, and it was great. They've only had 1 hour. They've only played for 1 hour, and I probably in terms of like research and painting them and building them, and also putting in some terrain, probably about 50 hours, right, for 1 hour of game. But you know what? Actually, it's worth it. Like, I really enjoy painting them, and I really enjoy making them and everything and stuff. And I'm sure they will eventually have more opponents, right? They're waiting for it. But I think it's a great use of time to devote yourself and your time to like little details about the world and stuff. It's a good thing.
One of the things I've learned over the last 6 months when you're playing with different people, like Joe's made a great point there, like the corner Twitter like that we have, I suppose, if you want to use, that's the room that we're operating within. But so many people that I've played with, the narrative element that you've talked about, Andrew, and then coming back to Joe's point about the level of time and effort that people have put into them of all levels, like whatever level of time, but it's someone's time that they've put into it. Level of time of thought and then of preparation or whatever. The bit where you put the narrative element into it for the historical stuff, the bit where you name the characters, is for me the transition, is the single biggest transition point from playing against an opponent to playing with an opponent. And I think there is a world of difference between the two. The historical bit for me, in terms of not who wins or what the result of it is, we've taken the inspiration from the historical aspect of it, and then we've pulled it onto the table, and we've spent however much time someone has to devote to it. It's valuable to them, however much time they put into it. And then you want to take that enjoyment from it. And so if you're playing with an opponent as opposed to against an opponent, both of you are writing the script to whatever it is that you're doing. So the result becomes almost irrelevant. I mean, we're still playing, obviously, but we're playing as the characters. As the story is unfolding, we're writing that narrative together. And that, for me, has been the single biggest learning point, takeaway, whatever term you want to use, over the last 6 months in terms of how I approach the historical gaming. It's not necessarily about who wins or who loses. We've done the research. We have had the inspiration. We've taken the time and the effort and the money to put it on the table. Now it's about the culminating point of all of that, which is maybe the game with like-minded people, like Joe, or yourself or whoever. And it's about playing with the people or the opponent, as opposed to just simply we're playing a game to win, which is, for me, just a non-consideration when it comes to historical wargaming. And we write that story. We write the after-action review. We write the medal citations or the mentioned in dispatches thereafter, and that's the bit where you can then, at the end of it, I find myself reflecting back on the 50 hours, Joe, painting that Panzer Grenadier Company, or that 90, whatever the ridiculous, time I spent painting that Panzer Grenadier Company last year. that's where the culminating point of all that comes, is for me, is where it all comes together. So I think that kind of ties into what both yourself and Joe are saying there. I think that is a kind of an important takeaway for me, I think, in terms of historical wargaming. The result is, whatever,
Well, I think on that rather uplifting note, I think it's probably a good time to draw things to a close. So thank you so much for your time this evening, chaps.
More than welcome. That was brilliant. I think we have another list of stuff that we need to do now. I mean, the next we have another 3 months of hobby projects listed there, Joe, I think, do we?
Well, in that case, then I think we'd better try and get a date in the diary and sit down and have another chat at some point. Then
definitely, after we've made some progress, hopefully.
Embarrassing. What have you done? Nothing.
No, nothing. Right, we need to pause. Take again. Stop.
No. We'd never get another show done if that was.
Yeah, never.
Well, look. Thank you all. Thank you both very much. I'm not entirely sure that we answered the question that we set out to answer at the start, but hopefully you've enjoyed the discussion.
Yeah.
Obviously, please check out all the other content on the channel. And if you like what you hear and see, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much. We'll speak to you again soon.